Hello, I'm Kira Sorrells, the founder and executive director of the NICU Parent Network and parent of two surviving 25-weeker triplets and four angel babies. Welcome to NICUnity. NICUnity is our all-encompassing educational initiative to foster a culture of belonging for all members of our community. Our monthly schedule of NICUnity discussions bring together NICU parent leaders, adult former NICU patients, healthcare partners, and maternal infant health stakeholders for candid discussions on diverse experiences in the NICU and beyond. Our goal is to shine a light on those who are often marginalized, silenced, and underestimated. And we are thrilled to be able to provide this platform for these raw, authentic conversations. So thank you for joining us as we embark on this journey of learning, growth, and unity. Together, we will build a stronger, more inclusive NICU community, one conversation at a time. For today's NICUnity Health Panel discussion, I'm joined by Darla Vasquez from the Eat to Grow course and NPN board member Thais Leverett for a vital discussion on supporting tube-fed NICU babies in overcoming their eating challenges. Today, we're going to gain insights, share experiences, and access expert guidance to empower both parents and babies on this journey to successful feeding and growth. So with that, I would like to introduce everybody to Darla. Darla is the mama of a former 27-weeker who spent the first 25 months of his life tube-fed. Through her online course, Eat to Grow, Darla supports other mamas who want to transition their tube-fed children to oral feeding without significant weight loss. Thais is the mother of three inspiring children, including a micro-preemie NICU graduate who was born at 26 weeks and was tube-fed until he was 8 years old. She's actively engaged in advocacy for neurodiversity and eliminating disparity in access to medical care and serves on our board at the NICU Parent Network. So thank you both so much for joining us. Feeding a NICU baby is very challenging and just emotionally wrought experience. I know for me as a mom of triplets, I had two babies who came home with NG tubes and then one who came home with a G tube. And I remember is very clearly, like the only reason the first two had to continue their NICU stay was because of their feeding. They just completely, it's like they hit 4 bottles a day and they just stopped. They were like, that's it. I can't do any more. And we really had to fight pretty hard to be able to bring them both home with NG tubes, which they then had till they were like 10 months old. And I just remember, how frustrating it was when you would have that poor feeding because, it made me feel like something was wrong with me, that I couldn't feed my own babies. Like I'm their mom. I'm supposed to be able to feed my babies, right?
Mhm.
And I just think about that a lot with our NICU families and NICU parents, and just how I actually was on a call yesterday with some other trauma-informed professionals, and they were talking about this exact thing, that we use the word feeding, which is something that we're doing to somebody, and we don't talk about eating, which is, something you do with your baby. And it feels very much like that. Um, so I don't know. Darla, can you relate to that? Tell me a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, definitely. In the NICU, the major goals are eating and breathing, right? And that's
Mhm.
pretty much what they tell everybody when they come in. When your baby can eat and breathe, then your baby can go home unless they have significant other problems in a major like cardiological area, something
Mhm.
like that. And my son had problems with both.
Mhm.
And that's why we were in the NICU for 203 days. And
Mhm.
I pumped every one of those days every 3 hours for those 6.5 months that he was in the NICU. And that was really taxing emotionally and physically on me
Sure.
in
Mhm.
general. But on top of that, him being tube fed was it was difficult. I was excited that we got to do kangaroo care. We were all about kangaroo care. And I was so excited about that because at least I got to bond with him while he was eating.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband had that same, he couldn't give him a bottle, but he could at least hold him. Um,
Yeah.
but we spent a lot of time wondering, like, is today going to be the day? Because the
Mm,
nurses tended to tell us, hey, um, the they will get it in their own time. Typically they get it in their own time, and it's just one
mm-hmm.
day they get it. I
Mm-hmm.
heard that a lot. But and so every day we would be like, is today the day? Is today the day?
Mm, mm-hmm.
And then we came home because basically the staff said, well, you can stay for a few more months and see if he can eat, or you can put in a G tube and go home. So that wasn't a hard decision for us. We're like, where do we
Right.
sign? We want to go
Yeah.
home. But unfortunately, when the G tube went in, the vomiting started,
Mm,
and that totally changed our life and the quality of life for our son. And we used to have formula cans that we'd leave, empty formula cans that we'd leave all around the house, so that when he gets sick, we'd have a receptacle to give him,
uh-huh.
so that we
Yep.
wouldn't, have to wash, a ton of laundry cleaning up those things. It was like the roof was leaking, but that's how many formula cans we had around
Right.
just to be ready. And
Oh,
so
wow.
that whole experience was extremely taxing, not just on my son, but on me and my husband as well. So,
Yeah,
yeah, I can definitely
absolutely.
relate.
Yeah. I just remember when we did have Avery and Lily home with their NG tubes, because I just had this message like they have to get the calories in, they have to grow because,
Yes.
that's when they're going to get better. They have to grow, they have to grow, they got to get their calories, got to get their calories. And so there was no bonding experienced around those feedings with them at all. It was like support the chin, squeeze the cheeks, keep them awake, hold the bottle just like this. And, it was like all these things that you were trying to do just to get the calories in. And now having a full term baby that had no issues eating, it really has shown me just how much I think NICU parents get robbed of, when it comes to that that time when you're supposed to be spending that time, oh, sorry, could you guys hear that? I'm gonna pause right here for a second. My little notifications went off.
Oh, I didn't hear
No, I
anything,
can
but
hear
there's
it.
a
Oh,
thunderstorm
really?
behind.
No,
Okay.
I think I've
Okay.
silenced mine, so hopefully I don't
Yeah.
have that same challenge.
Yeah,
Okay,
there's
let
a
me start.
thunderstorm behind me. I don't know if y'all can hear the
Okay.
thunderstorm.
Nope, I can't hear
Nope.
that at all.
All right, good.
Okay, so let me start over with the part about NICU parents being robbed. Yeah. Um, I just think about I feel like NICU parents really get robbed of that opportunity to bond because you're supposed to feed a baby every
True.
3 hours, basically, right? And whether it's because now they're being G tube fed, you don't have that oral feeding at all, or like with my husband and I, we were so focused on supporting the chin, like I said, and holding the bottle just right. And
Yeah.
it was so stressful. And then you just feel so defeated if they don't finish the bottle. And like, oh my gosh, they're never going to get this. But Ty, what about you? I see you nodding your head a lot. So I'm
Yes.
guessing this rings true for your experience as well.
It definitely does, Kira, and Darla as well. I think I can take from both of your experiences. So my son was born, as I mentioned, at 26 weeks, and immediately in the delivery room, he was intubated. So obviously there was no feeding of any kind happening while there's oxygen being fed to your body. So as you mentioned, Darla, I
Right.
like how you said it. The two goals in the NICU are oxygen, well, breathing and eating. And of course, if you have to prioritize, it's the breathing, right? Because without that, nothing happens. So he was on a ventilator for about a month. So the first month of his life, it was just the ventilator and I believe the TPN that they give you through an NG tube.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, he was switched to CPAP, and periodically we were allowed to try to feed him with a bottle. At the time, I was pumping as well, Darla, trying to make sure that I can get as much as I could. But unfortunately, in that same window when my son was very new, my father passed away, right? So
Mm,
when
Mhm.
that happened, we went dry as the Sahara Desert. There was nothing else happening.
Mhm.
So we had to
Yeah.
kind of go to formula and fortifiers. But at that point, he still was not able to feed orally due to the amount of respiratory support he continued to need. So at about 2.5, 3 months, the doctor comes in and has a conversation with us about a G-tube placement. NG tube is not going to suffice. We probably need to switch and have a new strategy to get him on a G tube. Of course, all this is brand new to me because for me, my preemie was my third child. So my other two
Mhm.
were full term. I was able to nurse them for a window of both of their lives. So this is
Mhm.
all a whirlwind of things to me, trying to understand and comprehend, okay, what does this G-tube mean? Do we have to do this? Can we still
Mhm.
try to get him to take food orally? But they were so fearful of respiration, or excuse me, aspiration,
Mhm.
that
Right.
just wasn't an option for us at the time because we even did a couple of tests and every time he basically failed the test.
Yeah.
So we said, all right, if we're going to do the G tube, how long is this going to be in there? And I think that is something very critical that NICUs uh, should be very careful in communicating to parents.
Mm.
Because I
Mhm.
heard one school of thought, oh, usually, once they're discharged from the NICU, they're able to kind of do some oral feeding and we can talk about G-tube removal. So that's the mindset that I had when my son
Mhm.
went in at
mm,
about 3 months to get this G-tube placed. So we have the G-tube procedure. It's in there. Almost immediately, he got an infection after the surgery.
Mm.
mm,
So I was freaking out about that. So we're
Yeah.
kind of learning how to manage the G-tube. And at the time, it was the actual one that was on the outside before we switched to the button that you both are probably
Mhm.
familiar with as well. And it was just pervasive. He ends up getting discharged after 7 months in the NICU. The G tube's still there. Hit the first birthday, G tube's still there. We're trying to give him birthday cake. He's not even interested in it because he's
Mhm.
getting G
yeah,
tube. He's getting feedings through the tube. And obviously, probably throughout this conversation, we'll talk about what day-to-day life was like on a
Yeah.
tube fed with a tube fed baby.
Yeah.
But the G2 celebrated so many birthdays with us. I thought it was never going to go away.
Yeah.
This is, of course, intermixed with getting feeding therapy and oral stimulation therapy and trying different foods and running the whole gamut, switching providers to see if maybe we could get access to a different level of oral stimulation to get him to eat. And
Mhm.
it kind of ended with, him starting to show interest in that. Um, but my thought being different than the doctor's thought and me having to advocate for my son's tube removal. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about
Mhm.
that as well.
Yeah.
But I think if I had not done what I had done at the time, my son may still be on the tube and he's now 10.
Yeah.
So obviously we'll talk about those outcomes, but it was definitely a journey getting from that initial placement to where we are now. And I just
Mhm.
think, a lot of the conversation that we can have, the three of us is, what messaging is happening. And I
Mhm.
think resources like what you've created, Darla, is remarkable because I wish I had your course in
Mhm.
trying to navigate this because it's kind of like
Right.
a very empty area when you're trying to figure out
Mhm.
what to do and
Yeah.
advocate for your child to go
yeah.
from tube to feeding.
Absolutely. Did you all have, kind of these similar feelings like I had about just feeling that kind of guilt and that like, why can't I do this? And I'm supposed to be able to feed my child. Did you guys deal with that as well?
I definitely could
Hi.
say that I did have feelings of guilt. Again, with him being my third and the previous two, I didn't have these challenges. So, wondering, am I doing something wrong? Should I have tried harder when he was in the NICU? Should I be doing
Mhm.
something different? Is there something missing in what we're trying to do at home? So I
Mhm.
definitely had those feelings of guilt for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, Darla, what about you? Did you have any, emotional responses, I would say, or, internal conflicts or dialogues in terms of, being able to feed your child?
Yeah, so in the NICU, there's a very complex dynamic between the doctors and the nurses' thoughts. That's what I picked up, and so most of the vibes I got from the nurses is like, "Oh, he'll do great. He'll catch up. It's just a matter of time." Right? The doctors were on the opposite ends of the spectrum. The doctors were the ones that came and said he might never walk, he might never talk, he might never breathe on his own, he might be on a trach for the rest of his life. And so, while I wouldn't want to sacrifice all those positive things that the nurses had to say and just have the doctor's perspective, it was really hard to navigate that situation,
Mm.
and to really like know what to expect. You really can't know what to expect, right?
Right.
But we found out later that my son is autistic, and so the typical journey was not our journey. And so
Mhm.
we recognized that when the nurses were saying, oh, typically this, typically that,
Mm.
that wasn't going to be our life. And so when we got home and the struggle was real with eating, and it just persevered and persevered, the respiratory issues, they faded away by Mother's Day. We had been home for 2 months. I was so thankful
Mhm.
because the pulmonologist actually called me on Mother's Day to tell me I could take the oxygen off. I thought that was the most beautiful
Oh,
thing. I'll tell that story forever.
yeah.
But the respiratory issues, he grew and matured out of those, but the feeding ones he didn't. And so
Hmm.
it's this idea of like, how do I navigate what to do next if I have all these
Hmm.
different voices telling me worst case scenario, best case scenario? Like, who do I follow? Do I go about
Right.
with positivity, or do I kind of hold back? Am I more reserved? Like, how,
Hmm.
how do I give my son the best outcome?
Right. Yeah. You know, that kind of actually leads me back to into my next question about that messaging that we get from the NICU. Like, you know, like I said, with in my personal experience, it was you've got to get the calories in. They have to grow because, you know, they're never going to catch up if they, you know, there was that catch up uh thing that was kind of drilled in as well. And I think again that was while clinically that was true, we did need to get the calories in. They do need to grow. I think there wasn't, I wish that there had been more emphasis on, you know, they may be on their own trajectory, you know, which is something the pediatrician finally told me because, you know, one of my daughters, she has been basically on the growth chart like 2% like her entire life. She's 17 now. And, you know, and I was like, should I be worried about this? And she said, as long as, you know, we're trending, she's just creating her own chart and that's okay. And I wish that I had maybe heard more of that. So what about you? Was there any messaging that was helpful or not helpful or both um, from the NICU that you kind of carried home with you? Ty, you want to
Sure.
take that one
I
first?
think for me, so it's twofold, and it's really both of those things, Kiera. So I think our NICU, we were well educated on the process of tube feeding when we left. We had all the equipment, we had everything lined up, we had resources to call if there was an issue. I mean, they gave us all the stuff. So we were well informed and well trained on what to do from a day-to-day procedural type of strategy.
Hmm.
But where we lacked, and I agree with what you shared, Kira, is having managed expectations on
Mm.
what that was actually going to look like from a growth perspective and a developmental perspective. So
Hmm.
again, I think I left with the mindset, okay, this is not going to be a long-term thing. Eventually, he's going to take to eating orally. Eventually, he's going to, get this tube out. And we went home on 1 liter of oxygen. So we were already still receiving respiratory support at a
Hmm.
very minimal level. So he still had the oral availability to eat, but
Hmm.
there just wasn't interest from him.
Hmm.
So we started with the interventions at that time. And then the whole time I'm thinking, okay, when are we done here? When's this tube coming out? And it got to
Right.
the point where we had a nickname for the tube. So I knew, okay, we've gotten close now. Now we're so close to friends. Now
Part of
it's
the
got a
family.
nickname. Like, we need to get it out of here. So
Uh-huh.
I think what's missing from a communication standpoint is just what your pediatrician told you, Kiara. Like, this is going to be your child's own path. We can share
Mhm.
with you typical scenarios. We can share with you anecdotes. We can share with you averages from a medical perspective, with the realization, though, that all of this is just an aggregate of what could happen. Yet your own child is going to do their own thing. My
Mhm.
son still is at the very bottom of the growth chart in terms of height, in terms of weight. He's still very, very thin. I
Mhm.
say that he's 10, but in appearance, he doesn't look 10. You might think
Mhm.
7, 8, until he starts talking to you, then you're like, oh God, you're 40. But otherwise, he's still very small. And so
Yeah.
that's still an adjustment that I have to make. Like, all right, he's going to do things on his own time. He's here now. He's fully orally eating. And let
Mhm.
me just celebrate those wins and just see what continues to happen to him from a growth perspective. But that is not the messaging or the mindset that I left the NICU with, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you, darling? I mean, it sounds like certainly there was a lack of consistency in the messaging that you were getting in the NICU. Was there anything that was helpful or anything else, that kind of stuck in your head once you went home with your son on the tube?
Well, I think that I agree with everything that y'all have said too. And I think that there was this idea to keep him gaining weight, and that was the biggest idea.
Hmm.
And it didn't seem to matter how he gained weight. And I got that a lot from the practitioners when he was profusely vomiting multiple times a day. And I was
Hmm.
told to give him more in the tube. And I just couldn't process that. I couldn't,
Yeah.
as a mother, I had no idea how to stand in that room and accept that advice, because I did not think that it was good advice. I thought surely
Hmm.
there has to be a better way. And that is the message that I got. You know what? He's going to
Yeah.
eat, and he's going to eat no matter what. And that's what we're going to do. And we're going to feed
Hmm.
him, whether he's comfortable, whether he's uncomfortable, whether he actually gets bigger or doesn't get bigger. We're going to do this thing that we're supposed to do, which is called
Right.
feeding him. And
Right.
um, and a lot of times that happens, unfortunately, in the autistic community. We want as neurotypical people want that for that autistic people just kind of produce something. I want you to do what you're supposed to do, and then it's not, they're not capable of doing that at that time in that way. And so I
Mm.
wish I had been given a toolbox. I
Mm.
wish I had
Hmm.
been given options. Y'all say that it would have been better to hear, yes, they're going to be on their own growth chart. I definitely
Hmm.
agree with that. A lot of research shows that kids, basically, when they're not, fed things that, a lot of unhealthy things, they tend to trend the same growth percentage that they were born in. So my
Hmm.
son was born in the a 10th percentile, and that's where he is still now.
Hmm.
Not for weight, but
Right.
for height, but for
Yeah.
height. So uh, I definitely agree with that, but I wish that there had been more options given to me, like, we might try this, and it just
Hmm.
might flat out not work. They call it
Right.
practicing medicine, but nobody wants
Right.
to admit, like, we're just practicing here. We really
Right.
don't know what's going to
Right.
work. And
Yep.
and that's what I've spent a lot of time talking to people about, like, how many tools do you have in your toolbox? Because there's one tool that works for your child, or maybe a handful. But if you have a child like mine that really struggles to eat, it's not going to be it's going to be a specific tool that you have to use, and you have to learn which tool works.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's, for those who maybe haven't had a tube fed child, Can we talk about, what a day in the life was kind of like during that first year after the NICU, or, at any point that you want to share? I remember adhering to a very strict time schedule and feeding therapy. And, when you were talking about even if he throws up, keep feeding him. I mean, that's the way I felt with my girls with the NG tubes. We would do oral feedings during the day, and then at night we would do the balance of what they needed in the tube. But if they had a really poor feeding day, I just felt like I was flooding them at night, and that the rate on the pump was going to be too fast in order to get the calories. And it was almost like a moral or an ethical dilemma, I think, for me, because it was, like you're saying, Darla, it's like they need to grow. And I just remember really struggling with, okay, medical advice says they need to grow, so they need these calories. The parent in me says this is going to make them throw up in the middle of the night for sure. And how is that good? So, anyway, Darla, what was a kind of a day in the life like um, for you and your son?
Oh, we were definitely extremely structured. Of course, being in the
Mhm.
NICU for 6.5 months, when it is your first kid that goes in the NICU and you bring them home and they already know when to sleep and when to eat, it's totally different with the rest of your children. So, but we were every 3 hours that he ate, and unfortunately, because of the vomiting, it would take an hour to feed him. And then we would keep him still for an hour because honestly, that's what we thought was the best thing to do. If I could go back and tell myself something different, I would. And I try to educate other parents differently, but we were just trying to get it down,
Hmm.
and
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 keep it down.
yeah, and have him keep it
Hmm.
down, right? And then he'd
Yep.
have like 30 minutes that he could move around, and then we had to give a medicine that 30 minutes before the next feed. And
Hmm.
so he basically had 30 minutes every cycle, every 3 hour cycle that he could actually move
Mm.
around and do things, which really affected him developmentally.
Mm.
um,
Hmm.
we definitely scheduled those therapy visits around the feeding schedule. Like, you're not going to
Right.
take my kid off his feeding schedule. So,
Hmm.
and we were
Right.
so thankful to have wonderful ECI caregivers and private therapists that came in
Hmm.
and provided that support. You know, at times that worked for us, and he had a
Hmm.
great support at home. Um, and we just kept going on that schedule for
Yeah.
honestly years.
Hmm.
Even after he got off the tube, he still ate for every 3 hours, every three waking hours, until he was about maybe 7 or 8.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. You know what? That made me remember that's exactly what we would do too, is that we would keep them upright and basically, still to make sure
Yeah.
it stayed down. And it was like if there was a feeding that took extra long, it felt like, okay, it's time to eat again. And again, it's like that conflict, I think, inside of me was like, how are they going to want to eat again right now? But I have to because they have to grow. But what about you, Ty? What was a kind of a day in the life for you guys like? And I'm
Yeah, really.
particularly interested to hear not just as an infant, but as he got older as well,
Oh,
if
for
you can
sure.
share.
I got stories. So yeah,
Mhm.
so starting off is very similar. We had to have him on a regular schedule, but he had a pump, right?
Mhm.
So
Okay.
during when he was brand new home, it was kind of a certain window of hours, maybe 2 to 3 hours during the day. We had very slow, just continuous feeding every couple of
Mhm.
hours to be off and on. But then overnight, he had an overnight feeding that just ran very, very slow. Like, you would hang his bag of
Mhm.
food and
Yep.
fix all the tubes, make sure he was good to go, tucked in. At the time, we still had him on an O2 monitor, so it was like all this. It was like mission control in this
Right.
baby's
Yep.
room. We had it all.
Yep. Mhm.
So that continued for quite a while, and then we were able to switch at some point, probably right after maybe a year and a half, a little bit give or take, to giving him bolus feeds. So just as a giant syringe of food, um, during the day, every couple of hours, but still running his night feeds continuously. And both of you had shared the whole goal with this was calories, 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 calories. Now, when he continued to not really grow at the rate that the pediatrician and his nutritionist thought that he should, then it's like you become a mad scientist because they want you to start adding stuff into the formula. Well, add olive oil, blend it down with peanut butter, add this, add that. So we started, literally it was a laboratory. We're like coming in with beakers and containers and mixing this, mixing that, trying to make it more calorie enhanced for each feeding. And he still, had challenges, still achieving growth. So as he got older, we did some research and investigated. We found one company called Real Food Blends. I know there's a lot of other companies that provide the same type of nutrition, but it's actual food. So a balanced meal with a veggie, a carb, some sort of meat source. They even have vegan options if that's someone's thing. Giving you an actual pureed dinner. And so we were doing that for a while. And in ordering those, and they would just come in big boxes of different varieties. And I thought to myself, okay, how about I just cook food and just puree it down myself? So we were trying that, trying to just get calories in, but make sure he was getting balanced food. So it just was a lot of trial and error. I think you said that as well, Darla. It's like, let's try this. If that doesn't work, let's try that. Another thing that, I think we all probably, each of us had to navigate is it's easy when you're doing this at home, but you get to a point like, okay, we're going to take this kid out the house. And then what are we doing then? And so the first major trip, I brought my son to Michigan. At the time I was living in Philadelphia and my home is Michigan. So it was, all right, we road trip to Michigan. And you're bringing, the pump, you're bringing all the food, you're bringing all the tubes, you're bringing all, you're almost like you have your own little mini medical hospital bag, if you will. It's just everything else that you bring traveling with a kid. So it's also learning how to do all of this, but on the road or in motion or just going to the mall or grocery store. So, it's just a lot that, especially with him being on it for so long, we had to consider. And one other thing I'll share is like, again, it's also easy when they're kind of a baby and they're only doing a couple things. But, here he is growing and now we're crawling, now we're walking, now we want to play, now we want to be at school. So we had to have someone come in and teach school professionals how to do his lunchtime or his midday feeding. So he would come from class, go to the nurse's office, they would do his bolus feeding, and then, he'd go off onto his school day. But it's also then getting these little covers to protect the tubie because nothing's going to stop him from running around and doing his thing on the playground. But if it would bump the tubie, sometimes it would be sensitive and, sometimes he would be upset. So it was all those things that we had to try to consider while he grew up still on the tube that we hadn't really thought about or even really talked about when he was young, getting discharged with that.
Yeah, for sure. And was there a point where he basically, where he realized maybe he was a little different because he was like, did that ever come up like socially with other kids or not so much?
I think we were right in the window where that was starting to happen right when it was coming out. But some kids would ask him, because he's an exhibitionist. He had no problem being like, look at my tube. And so kids would be like, why do you have that? And then he would have his own spiel. I was born premature and this is how I eat my food. And, it was almost like a marvel to the other kids, like, oh my gosh, what is that? And I used to call it his gas tank. So that was his little name for it as well. My gas tank. That's where I get my fuel. But so he kind of embraced it in one sense, but also sometimes it was painful or we get irritated. You have to turn it. And then anytime we had to do a tube change, it was like the absolute worst. And I was always the bad guy. Like my husband was like, you're doing the tube change. You got a biology degree, so that's on you, sister. So I was always the bad guy doing which was uncomfortable. So I think that started to play on him from a psychological perspective. Like the tube hurt sometimes. My friends don't have it. I don't want anyone to touch it. Other than me showing it off, I don't want anyone to touch it. How long am I going to have this? So I think it began to have more meaning to him in that sense as he got older. Sure.
Yeah.